Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name's Richard Walsh, and I'm one of NQA's principal assessors. If you've been with me before on webinars, you'll probably know the drill by now. If you haven't, I shall run through a little bit of housekeeping in a short while. So, I'm just running through those first slides pretty quickly because we're somewhat time limited today. Normally, when I do these webinars, we've got, within reason, an unlimited amount of time. Unfortunately, this afternoon seems to be an afternoon of webinars, and we only have so many logins, if you like, to this system that we use for running webinars. So we do need to be finished promptly by 10 to 3. That's 10 to 3 UK time. It's currently 1 minute past 2 here, so we've just less than 50 minutes to get through. That's me. If you haven't met me before, as I say, I'm one of NQA's principal assessors, and I look after energy and environment. So it will be sort of a 45-minute webinar this time. We normally run for about an hour and 10 minutes by the time we've finished, but this afternoon it will be 45 minutes. If anybody wants to jot any questions down on the box that you should have on your screen that's managing GoToWebinar, you should see somewhere under there a box that says questions. If you have any questions, just type them in there and we'll try and deal with them as we go along. If not, then we will get back to you with some questions. So we might not quite have as much time this afternoon as we would have liked for questions towards the end. However, there's no need to frantically scribble down everything I'm saying. Everybody who's registered for the webinar will get a copy of the slides in PDF format and also a link to a YouTube recording of this webinar as well. So I think that's all. So without further ado, what we're going to do, we're going to go through a little bit about the standard itself, some of the new concepts that this newish standard, obviously it's 3 years old now, the 2018 version of 50,001. We're going to go through some of the concepts in there, have a look at the clauses, have a look a little bit at the transition process, and a little section at the end on top tips. So hopefully what you're going to learn is what 50,001's all about, some new terminology, important definitions, the clauses, that's the main bit we're going to have a look at, and a little bit towards the end on preparing for the changes. Prior to just coming into this, I've just sat through a presentation from our managing director giving us an update on where we are with things. And at the moment, in terms of 50,001, 83% of our certificated clients have transitioned to the new standard, 83%. And obviously that means that there are 17% still have to make that transition. And as you will gather from the title of this assessment, this webinar, there is only 4 months left, and we'll look at that and what that might mean if transition isn't achieved in time. So at the moment within NQA, we are at 83%. So all of these new standards, so this standard, the 2018 version of 50,001, ISO 14,001, 2015, same with ISO 9000, 2015, and indeed ISO 45,001 and lots of other standards now, all have intended outcomes. So what will happen, or what does the standard hope will happen by an organization managing its, in this case, energy through the use of the standard? So what the standard is intending are 3 things: continual improvement in energy performance, and that is very, very important, particularly in this standard. Fulfillment of compliance obligations, so any obligations that you might have, be they legal or other requirements related to energy use, and ultimately the achievement of energy objectives. Like the other standards, this standard is also a little bit more focused on the management of change. So there's a section in there about planning and the planning process, and looking at being a little bit more proactive. So rather than things just happening, it's making sure that things happen in a planned and managed way. Managing risk, and of course the standard has been designed to be easily integrated with other standards within the ISO family, if you like. So this is where we are with 50,001. The original standard was issued in 2011. 2017, 4 years ago now, the draft updated standard was issued. The new standard itself was issued on the 21st of August 2018, and the transition time frame should have ended on the 21st of August this year. However, similarly as happened with ISO 45001 health and safety, due to COVID and the delays that people have had in having assessments, in getting things sorted out, staff working from home, staff working off site, it was decided to push that back and give people a little bit of extra time. So the closing date for the transition is now the 31st of January 2022, so just slightly more than 4 months away, 4 months and a week if you like. Anybody who hasn't transitioned by that date, anybody who is still in possession of a 2011 standard, that was the original standard, anybody who hasn't transitioned will wake up on the 1st of February to find that your certificate is out of date and you do not have 50,001. That is very important for people using 50,001 for ESOS compliance here in the UK, because there is a requirement that you have a current and up-to-date certificate. So you can't just sit there and do nothing and hope this will go away. If you haven't transitioned by the 31st of January, on the 1st of February, you will not be certified to 50,001. I don't care which certification body you're with, that is the case across the board. Standards are always changing. The cynic says it keeps us in a job. Maybe it does, but standards do change regularly. Normally standards are changing around every 5, 6, maybe 7 years. I do know that work is starting on newer versions of 9001, 14,001. Doesn't seem 2 minutes since we transitioned to those, but work is already commencing on looking at those standards. The world changes. Our understanding of quality and environment and energy and health and safety, that changes. So the standards need to change to maintain their relevance to industry and all the other organisations that use them. It's expected that this standard may well be in place for up to 10 years, so it could well be late 2020s before we see a revision to this standard. Although there is a government consultation here in the UK looking at its relevance to things like ESOS and SECR, which is the board reporting of energy and carbon. So there's a bit of an ongoing discussion around that. Whether that will prompt a change, I don't know at this stage. I suspect not. Obviously, organisations become increasingly more complex. The environments in which we work are becoming more complex. And also these standards have been written in such a way as to try and deflect any criticism that might have been levied at previous versions, that these standards looked okay if you were a manufacturing organisation, but if you're in the service sector, they didn't quite make sense. So these standards are all about reflecting the needs of all potential users. There's a much greater emphasis in all of these standards again on corporate governance. So again, we've gone from senior management commitment, which was the phraseology used in the older standards, into now focusing very much on corporate governance. And a part of that is this new clause, which is across all of the standards, which is called leadership. And it's not just about senior managers, senior staff within a business at director level, whatever level they are. None of them just being committed to this. They have to demonstrate that walk the walk, not just talk the talk, if you like. And ultimately, as I say, all of these standards, all the new standards that are on this, what's called the Annex SL format, they are all written out in such a way that they will easily integrate. This standard itself is in the Annex L format in the main. There are a couple of rather annoying areas where it's gone away from that, and we'll cover those as we go through. So if you've worked on 14,001, if you've worked on 9,001, you will easily recognize this Annex SL format, clauses 1 to 10. Don't confuse clause 1 scope with the scope of the system, of either your system or your client's system if you happen to be a consultant. Clause 1 scope deals with the scope of the standard itself, what the standard's there for, what the standard's trying to achieve. The bits that we're interested in as a certification body, the bits that the clients are interested in, the bits that the businesses are interested in is the 7 auditable clauses, clauses 4 through to 10, and that goes for all of these different standards. I tend to like to see things set out in a linear fashion. I find it a little bit easier to understand. All of these standards follow the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the Deming cycle, if you happen to be a quality expert, and that is a slide that shows the clauses of the standard set out as Plan, Do, Check, Act, but set out in this linear fashion. And you can see there the relevant bits, the main headings, and the sub clauses across all of the 7 areas that we're going to have a look at. And the vast majority of this presentation in the remaining sort of 40 minutes we've got is going to take us through those slides to make sure that we understand what 50,001 is meaning when it looks at each of these areas. Remember, the whole point of all of these new standards, the Annex SL format, is to allow for much easier integration. And that's all that slide is trying to show, that all of the clauses align and therefore the standards do dovetail together very, very nicely. So nobody's asked any questions yet, that's fine. Just a reminder that, of course, if you have any questions that you want to ask as we're going through, do type them in the question box that you'll see on the GoToWebinar control panel. If we get any, I'll try and answer them as we go along, and we'll see where we are. So all of these standards, 50,001 included, start off with the context of the organisation. So the context of the organisation is all about where do we sit. Where are we in terms of energy management? What is it that's important to us? What are the external issues? What are the internal issues that are relevant to our organisation's purpose? The easiest way to look at this, because what we do at this level, what we do at clause 4.1 feeds through into clause 6.1, which is risks and opportunities. When you're thinking about context, bear in mind that the expected outcome of the standard is the improved performance of how we use energy, improved energy performance. There are things that are going to help you achieve that, and there are things that are going to get in the way. These are the things that are we consider under context. So the things that are going to help us achieve this are going to be the opportunities. The things that are going to get in the way are the risk. I said I'd try and answer questions as we go along. I will. Would a transition audit require more man days than a regular surveillance? Yes, they would. It's been decided, certainly here in the UK, that a transition audit needs 1 extra day. So if it's been done as a surveillance, if your surveillance visit would be 2 days, then a transition audit would be 3 days. So whatever the type of audit that you have planned, it will add 1 extra day to the audit, irrespective of size. Doesn't matter whether you've got 15 days as an audit, it will still just add 1 extra day. That might seem a bit harsh if you are a small business. If it's a 1-day audit, we're going to be doubling the size of your audit, but that's how it's been decided here in the UK. So going back to context, so the requirement of this clause is to consider the organisation's context and also, moving on a little bit, the needs of interested parties. And it's all about making sure that the whole system you've got in place is reflecting the needs of the organisation, reflecting the environment in which you operate, and is picking up the key issues. The standard doesn't tell you how you have to do any of this. This is just one way of looking at it, where we look at potential key issues. For 50,001, we would think maybe about energy-related issues, energy supply, availability, big hot topic in the UK at the moment. The weather, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, objectives of the sector that we happen to be working in. External issues, legal, regulatory, what's the economic situation we're in? Do we have, where are we with technology, etc., etc. and internally, what's our own strategic direction? What capabilities have we got within the organisation? What's our current legislative compliance status? What's the culture of the organisations? Have we got any other standards that this would dovetail into? So these are the sorts of things that we think about in this area of context. But ultimately, the whole idea of this is to provide a high-level conceptual understanding of what the important issues are. And it's issues that can positively or negatively affect the way in which energy responsibilities are managed. And what you do at clause 4.1 feeds directly into clause 6.1, which are the opportunities and threats. So, interested parties, this is all about thinking about who has an interest in what we do, who has a genuine requirement, if you like, to understand how we as a business, how we as an organisation manage our energy. So it's a matter of working out what those requirements are. You can choose whether you comply or not. However, this is one of the key areas where this standard has gone away a little bit from the Annex SL format. If you're familiar with ISO 14001 or ISO 45001, there is a specific clause in the planning section in clause 6. There is a specific clause on compliance obligations. There isn't in this standard. What they've done is they've tucked away regulatory requirements, legislative requirements, call them what you will. They've tucked those away under interested parties. Now, if you're doing this standard alongside another standard, 14,001 maybe, it doesn't matter where you put it. The fact that this standard puts it under 4.2, if you want to address it in the way that 14,001 addresses it, by having a compliance obligations register, then that's quite acceptable to do so. And don't let anybody tell you it's not, because it doesn't matter how or where you do this, so long as you meet the requirements of the standard. I don't know why they've tucked it away where they have. It doesn't make sense to me. However, I'm just one lone voice trying to explain this to you all. So who might they be? I'm sure you've seen all these sort of slides before. Employees, board members, shareholders, customers, suppliers, etc., etc. That's a fairly common thing then when we're thinking about interested parties. Clause 4.3 looks at the scope of our energy management system. So we need to clarify the physical and organisational boundaries of the system. It doesn't have to be the whole organisation. I have a number of clients that have just looked at 50,001 for key areas, and that's quite acceptable, with one caveat, that the scope must include all the energy types that are used. So for instance, if you were an organisation that had a site that still ran on coal, you couldn't then say, well, do you know what, we'll leave that site out of scope. So the scope of the system must include all energy types that are used. If you're going to exclude a site, it can't have a unique energy type. So you have to make sure that the scope covers all of the different energy types used. Another question that we had a lot of interest in at the start of this process was that you must have the authority to control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption within the scope. We had a number of people that were in fully managed offices that said, our energy bills are as part of the rent. We don't see how much energy we're using. Can we still have 50,001 for that location? And the answer is yes. The question is, can you turn the lights on and off? Yes. Can you influence the heating on your floor? Maybe. Yes, you can. So therefore, you can control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption. However, the scope and boundaries of the system have to be documented and have to be made available within the business as documented information. So is it possible to implement 50,001 if you share premises and utilities are managed by a landlord? Yes, it is, Sarah, as I've just explained. You can do that. Obviously, it's good if you can get energy figures from the landlord, but so long as you can demonstrate that you can control energy use and energy consumption within that scope, then yes, in answer to the question, if you share premises and utilities are managed, quite possible to do that. I might ask why you would want to do it if that's the only site that you've got, but that's for another discussion. But the answer is yes, you can. And then finally, the little bit in clause 4 about the system itself. The standard requires that you implement, maintain, and continually improve the energy management system to achieve its intended outcome. So you've got to continually improve the system as well as continually improve your energy performance. Clause 5 leadership is very, very similar to all of the other standards. If you're familiar with 14,001, 9,001 and so on, you'll understand this. It's all about making sure that the management system isn't managed in isolation. It's considered when strategic business decisions are being made. Does it have the visibility that it needs at a senior management level? Are the energy objectives aligned with business objectives? Does it benefit from the appropriate level of resources? Now 7.1 is actually about resources, but actually it comes under leadership as well, because generally it's the leaders of the organization that provide us with the resources. Is it going to get the appropriate level of involvement? Does the senior management of the business, do they promote continual improvement? Are they promoting energy efficiency? Are they promoting use of the management system itself? And then the final bit, making sure that performance indicators, which we'll talk about shortly, appropriately represent the company's energy performance. So as I've said before, top management is defined in the system as the group of people or the person who directs and controls the organization at the highest level. If you are only using part of the site, so let's say you're a multi-site organization, but you're just using one site for 50,001, then top management is the highest degree of management within that business unit. However, all of these standards require top management to take full accountability for the effectiveness of the management system. So when I'm doing an assessment, I want to speak to the person who is the senior management representative on that site. And I want them to be able to tell me about the system. I want them to tell me about the effectiveness of the system, not to just say, oh, you need to speak to Fred down the corridor. He's the one that looks after all of this. The buck stops at a top management level. There is a requirement for an energy policy. There's always been a requirement for an energy policy. That hasn't changed. What has changed are a couple of the bullet points that have to be covered within there. It's obviously got to be appropriate to what the organisation does. It has to provide a framework for setting, reviewing energy objectives. This is a bit that quite often gets missed out. The policy has to commit to the availability of information and the necessary resources to achieve objectives and targets, has to commit to satisfy applicable legal requirements, has to commit to continual improvement of the system and energy performance, and has to support the design and procurement for energy efficiency. Again, we'll talk about that shortly. It always amazes me the number of clients that I go and visit when I look at the policy and it doesn't make all of these required commitments. I don't like talking about tick box exercises. However, the standard says the policy must say this, 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 and this. It's not rocket science to try and cross-check your policy against the standard, or even across this slide. If it doesn't make those commitments, you're going to get a non-conformance. It's fairly straightforward, is this? The policy has to make those first, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 commitments. It then has to be documented and made available to interested parties and also communicated internally. In common with the other Annex SL format standards, there is now no requirement for an energy manager. That's been dropped. However, unique to this standard and this standard alone is the formal requirement for an energy management team. That is a mandatory requirement within any organisation. Now, of course, I have had the question asked, can we have a team of one? And I would always say no, because the whole idea of that is to make sure that energy management is a multidisciplinary requirement across the business. So there needs to be an energy management team, and that is something that we and our assessors would be looking for. The key roles are there. The key roles are no different to any other standard and are no different to really the previous requirements. The difference being the old standard required an energy manager. The new standard has dropped that and replaced the energy manager with a team. So we would expect to see still an energy manager perhaps, but that energy manager would have to have a team around them. Clause 6 is where this starts to get interesting, starts to get into sort of specific requirements. So under planning, it's all about addressing those issues that we found in clauses 4.1 and 4.2. So the things that we came up with under context, the things that were going to help us, the things that were going to get in the way, the risks and the opportunities, we now have to start to address those issues. So the standard is set out very much like a flowchart. So clause 6, planning, it's making sure that our system meets the intended outcomes, and the main intended outcome is this continual improvement in energy performance. Ultimately, it's all about preventing or reducing undesired effects and taking advantage of the opportunities that we might have identified. But it's all about, as you see in red at the bottom of that slide, achieving continual improvement. So having identified what those risks and opportunities are, we have to address, or we have to put in place actions to address the risks and the opportunities. So how do we integrate and implement those actions into our management system? What are we going to do? How are we going to make sure that we grasp those opportunities? How are we going to make sure that we mitigate those risks? So we need to think about making sure that they're built into our management system, built into our way of working. And then through the audit process, through our data collection, data gathering, we have to evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. Objectives, energy targets and planning to achieve them. It's a policy commitment. The standard says that you have to have objectives. Interestingly, this I think is the only standard that's retained the term target. All the other standards talk about objectives and planning to achieve them. This standard does refer to objectives and targets. It may be because it's more likely that the targets for an energy standard might be more numerical. However, the objectives have to be consistent with the policy. They have to be measurable if practicable. You have to consider your SEUs. Now, you may not know what an SEU is. It's a significant energy use. I always find it interesting that the standard at 6.2 is using terminology that we haven't got to yet if we follow our way through the standard. The objectives have to be monitored, communicated, documented so that people are aware of them and updated regularly. And for all of the objectives, there has to be planned actions. Who, what, when, who's going to do them, when are we going to do them, what are we going to do? Do we need any resources? What resources are we going to need? Is that time? Is that equipment? How do we evaluate the results? So what are we going to choose? Any indicators? How are we going to measure what our progress is and make sure that the planning is integrated into our wider business processes? The standard requires that any organisation conducts an energy review. And this is a little bit like the energy version of an aspects and impacts evaluation in 14001. It's identifying how an organisation, how our organisation uses energy. Where do we use it? What's it used for? And how much do we use? So analysing energy use and consumption, looking at the current types of energy in use. Is it electricity? Is it gas? Is it diesel? What type of diesel? Is it red diesel? Is it white diesel? Whatever we're using. Looking at past and current energy usage. So historically, how have we used energy? How are we using energy currently? And what is our energy consumption? And based on that analysis, just in the same way that 14001 asks us to with our aspects and impacts, we have to identify what are the significant energy uses. So what is it that we've got? Is it a piece of kit? Is it heating? Is it lighting? Is it cooling? What is it that we've got that are the significant energy uses? So once those have been identified, and the standard doesn't tell you how you do that. In a lot of cases, the clients I've worked with, they will list out in a spreadsheet all of the different areas that use energy and then maybe take the top 10 or something like that. One organisation I work with used the 80-20 rule. and said we'll keep coming down the list till we've got 80% of our energy use, and they will be our significant energy users. The standard doesn't say how it's to be done. That's what you have consultants hopefully to help you with. But for the significant energy users, we have to then determine the relevant variables. So for any significant energy use, the standard says that there are two things. There are the static factors. So if we take a machine, the static factor is the machine itself. That's there, we switch it on and off as we need it. What's the variable? The variable is how much work it processes. Does it just run on one shift? Does it run on two shifts? How busy is it running all the time? Is it just running for 2 hours a day? So in that instance, the variable would be the amount of work the machine is undertaking. If we're thinking about heating or cooling, then the variable will be the weather. If it's cold, we're going to have the heating up more, and therefore we're going to use more energy. So we need to determine what the current energy performance is and identify the people that are in charge, that manage, that can influence and can affect each of those SEUs. So for every SEU, what's the variable? So what affects how much energy it uses and who is involved? And coming out of that, we then prioritize opportunities for improving our energy performance. That might be setting of objectives, setting different ways of working, better ways of managing things, and then something that has moved from the old standard to the new standard. In the old standard, this was in the management review. We then have to think about our future energy use. What might it look like in 6 months, 12 months time, and start to plan for the future, bearing in mind that the target is to improve our performance. So the energy review, as you would with aspects and impacts in 14001, the energy review doesn't just happen once, it's continually updated. Also would be updated in response to major changes in facilities, equipment, systems, or different processes. However, one of the things that this standard requires is that there is a documented methodology. So in other words, how do you do the management review? How's it controlled? How's it managed? Who does it? That has to be available as a documented process, if you like, the process of carrying out the energy review. It's no good just coming to an assessor who might come in to do this for you and saying, here's the results of our review. The assessor will ask you, where's your document that shows how this process is carried out? So normally for the SEUs, we then start to think about performance indicators, and the performance indicators have to be appropriate to measure energy performance. Now, normally the way to look at a performance indicator is to take the key variable. So for instance, if you're a manufacturing organization, your performance indicator might be kilowatt hours per widget produced. If you are looking at a performance indicator to do with heating, you might use what are known as heating degree days, which is a scientific way of looking at how warm or cold it's been. If you are an office-based organization, it might be done on footfall, it might be done on numbers of staff in the business, it could be done on square meterage of area. There's a whole number of things that you can actually use, but normally the performance indicator is an amount of energy versus the key variable, and that's the way to think about it. The final thing, or almost the final thing within this section, is to set a baseline. If we're going to think about improvement, we have to know where we're starting from, and the standard requires that a baseline is set. And the baseline needs to be a defined period of time. It's nearly always 12 months because one of the requirements of the baseline, it has to take into account all of the sort of key variables. So if you're to only take 6 months as a baseline, you might have missed winter, you might have missed your busy time, you might have missed your quiet time. So we would normally look for a full year. And then this is my tip, if you like, because I think this also helps. If I was coming in to audit one of you now, and you said we've set 2020 as our baseline, forget COVID, forget that last year wasn't maybe a true year. but think about the principle. If 2020 was your baseline, we haven't seen a full year since the baseline to see how you're progressing. So I always say, as a guide, allow 1 full year between the baseline and where we are now. So sat in 2021, I would prefer the baseline to be no later than 2019, because we've then got a full year that we can compare against the baseline. And then finally, we review our baseline and modify the baseline if things have changed. So let's say that you've put in a complete new heating system, which has been much more efficient. You would then need to go back and review the baseline, because clearly the baseline is not going to be as relevant. So major changes to the static factors would normally result in an amended baseline. Still no, only had the 2 questions. That's fine. I'm not going to keep chasing you for them. Just a quick reminder though that you can ask questions. As I said earlier, one of the things that this standard is trying to do is be much more proactive. So now you don't just do something, the standard requires that you plan to do it first. So clause 6.6 is a new clause which talks about planning for the collection of energy data. So having gone through our performance indicators, having gone through our energy review, having gone through what it is we think we need to know, we need to sit down and work out how are we going to collect that data, what equipment are we going to need, what data do we need, what frequency we do need to collect the data, the things that you see in the orange table at the bottom of the slide. So we need to think about that and present that quite often as part of our performance improvement plan, but how are we going to plan to collect the data that we need? I've missed out clause 7.1 because that's just resources, and we've talked about provision of resources under leadership. I'll skip through these slides pretty quickly because these clauses basically are the same as the existing 2011 clause, and this is all about the new standard. And also it's just the same as the other standards, 9,001, 14,001, etc., etc. So competency, all about making sure that people have the right competency to do the role that you expect of them. It's not just about training now, it is about competency. People can be competent on the basis of education, training, or experience. And if people haven't got the necessary competence, the standard requires that you allow them to do that through possibly training, through mentoring, use of additional staff, reassignment of staff, whatever. However, the standard does require that we maintain competency records. That's not just records of what people have done, but also records of desired competencies for each key role within our energy management system. Awareness, again, similar to the 2011 clause, people carrying out work have to be aware of what they're doing, have to be aware of the system, have to be aware of what's expected of them. Communication, there needs to be a process with who we're going to communicate, how we're going to communicate. The key slide for this one, or the key bullet point for this, is the 3rd bullet point. There needs to be a formal methodology within our business that allows us to solicit and then act upon feedback on improvements to our energy management system and to energy performance. Now that can be a suggestion scheme, it can be talking to people, but there needs to be a documented system in place whereby we can solicit feedback. And then finally, the standard requires that we hold a certain amount of documentation. And the next slide, people tell me, is probably one of the best slides out of the presentation. What I've done with that slide, I've been through the entire standard, and anywhere that the standard says documented information must be held. Now, I've used the term documents and records. The standard doesn't use that term anymore, but I've used that term because I think we can understand better what we mean. So documents tend to be information, records tend to, as the name suggests, record something. If you can go through that and use that as a tick box and say, our system includes all of that, then you shouldn't be far off having a successful transition. So everything on there is required by the standard to be documented in some format or other. Can be documented electronically, can be on a piece of paper, but it has to be documented. and an assessor can and will ask you for any or all of the things that are on that slide. Obviously, in order to improve our energy performance, we have to be able to control our processes. So therefore, the things that use the most amount of energy, we have to come up with a way of managing how that energy is used to control the processes that are related to our significant energy uses. We need to establish criteria. So if we take, say, an oven or something like that, how do we use the oven? How do we control the oven? How do we set the oven? What temperature do we set it at, etc., etc. So what is the criteria for managing the energy usage of that significant energy usage, as it's called? And make sure that the people using that equipment understand the criteria and understand what it is they're supposed to be doing and how they're using that. So we need to establish processes and procedures to look at the various operating equipment we've got, the facilities we've got, to make sure that people understand how it can be used, what level of autonomy people might have to make changes. If people want to make changes, how are those changes made? How do we plan to make those changes? And maybe and also have a way of reviewing the consequences of unintended changes. Things may change that are out of our control, and we also have to bear that in mind. Two clauses that come together very, very closely: design and purchasing. We have to design and purchase for energy efficiency. So if we're going to be if we've got 50,001 in place, we have to think about anything that we're going to change, anything we're going to manage, anything that we're going to update. We have to think about the energy performance of that equipment, whether it's facilities, whether it's equipment, whether it's new control systems, processes using energy. We need to think about the amount of energy that those are going to use. Likewise, with procurement, we need to evaluate energy performance over the planned or expected operating lifetime. So if you've got a choice between two pieces of machinery, everything else being equal in terms of price and delivery and performance, etc., etc., to think about which one over the next 10 years, 15 years, however long we're going to use this equipment, which one is going to be the more energy efficient. And also, as part of procurement, if we are procuring energy using equipment, as part of that procurement process, as part of that tendering opportunity, if that's what you're doing, it has to be communicated that energy performance will be one of the criteria used to evaluate the success of that tender. Clause 9, performance evaluation. Again, this is where we now start to measure how we're doing, how are we managing our energy, how are we managing our system. So we need to monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate our energy performance, including how the system itself is operating. This always makes me smile. Evaluation of compliance, we have to do it. There isn't a clause called legal and other requirements. As I said earlier, it's tucked away in needs of interested parties. However, we do have to evaluate our compliance, as we do with all the other standards, to evaluate our compliance with legal and other requirements. And interestingly, the standard still uses that term, not the term compliance obligations, which is used by the other main standards. Internal audit is no different to any of the other standards. We have to have an audit program. If it's an integrated system, integrated with other standards, it can be an integrated audit program, but there needs to be an audit program to look at the frequency, how often do we audit things, what methodology we're going to use, who's going to do the audit, how are we going to plan for the audit, and how are we going to report. However, the internal audits have to make sure that the areas we are auditing are contributing to overall energy performance improvement, and that's very important. Management review, inputs, outputs, yes we do, and those are the inputs and outputs as required. Right, a couple of questions which I'll try and answer because we've only got about 5 minutes left. Right. Do auditors need specific training to audit 50,000? That's up to you. Remember, competency. Do you consider your auditors to be competent, yes or no? If you consider them to be competent, then fine. They can just go ahead and do it. If they're not, you've got to allow them to achieve that competence. It doesn't necessarily have to be training. We try not to use the term training in all of these standards anymore. I would rather, Sarah, you'd have asked that question, do internal auditors need to be competent to audit 50,001? And the answer is yes, they do, but it's for you to decide what that competence might be. So again, it's not for me as an auditor to say, can I see the training records for those people you're using for internal audits? But they need to understand what it is they're auditing, yes. Colin, do we require procedures? I've just clicked there. Do we require procedures? 9,000, 14,000, we were told the opposite and you should focus on processes. Yes, we are still focusing on processes, but you've got to control those processes, and how you control those processes is important. So it's no different to any of the other standards. I might have used the word procedure. Did I use the word documented procedure? I don't think I did. There needs to be a process control mechanism. That may be a better term to use, but it's no different to the other standards. This standard looks at a process approach, not necessarily a procedural approach in terms of clause of the standard. So what you've been told, Colin, for 9 and 14 applies exactly to this standard as well. The final bit I want to get onto is this bit on improvement. So within 50,001, there is now this formal requirement for continual improvement in energy performance. Failure to achieve that will be a mandatory major non-conformance. That's the difference now with this standard and the other standards. The other standards do say that you've got to continually improve. This standard now says that if you don't continually improve, you won't meet the requirements of clause 10.2, and that is a mandatory major non-conformance. So failure to demonstrate continual improvement in energy performance is a major non-conformance. That is one of the sticking points, if you like, with this standard at the moment, and also now the area that we get most questions about. Now, bear in mind that it's not asking for a reduction in energy use. It's asking for an improvement in performance. So that might be kilowatt hours per widget. It might be kilowatt hours per square meterage of office space. If you suddenly double your turnover, this standard isn't going to penalise you because you're using more energy, so long as you're using that additional energy in a more prudent way, if you like. So the transition process, I'm conscious I've only got 2 minutes left and we can't go over. So last call for questions. If you don't get your questions asked, when you get next week, you will get an email early next week with the slides and a link to this recording. If you've any questions, reply to that email with your question and we will try and get back to you. I apologise for the tightness of time this afternoon. So the transition process is no different to the one you went through for 9,001 and 14,001. As I said earlier, all 50,001 2011 certificates expire on the 31st of January. We can do the transition audit either as a reassessment, we can do it as a surveillance, or we can do it as a standalone. As was asked earlier, if it's going to be done at any one of those normal audits, at a scheduled audit, it will add an extra day to that. So a summary then, so the new standard includes all of the Annex SL requirements, more or less. The standard has clarified what's meant by an energy review and given a little bit of extra guidance. It talks about performance indicators and baselines. That's what ENB is, and ENPI, energy performance indicator, energy baseline. There's this new clarification on data collection, having to pull a plan together on how we're going to collect the data. And the text itself on the performance indicators and the baseline has been clarified. So, final reminder, 31st of January 2022, only 83% of our clients have currently transitioned. They've only got 4 months left. 4 months and a week to be precise. It has been extended by 6 months or just under 6 months, but time is running short. So just to wrap up, take a fresh look at your EnMS. Take a look at it. Is it still fit for purpose? Have a look at our website. There's a whole load of information on there that you can use. There's a whole load of stuff that's available for you to download. Guidance, there's some transition guidance. There's a lot of stuff that I've written on there that will help you. Look at the key changes and opportunities for improvement. It's not there just to make your life difficult. Look at these changes and see them as opportunities for improvement. Make necessary changes to your documentation as necessary. And to pick up on the point that was raised earlier by Colin, don't just think about procedures, think about processes and how you're going to control the processes. Make sure that you understand the requirements on leadership, these new areas on risk and context. Review the effectiveness of your current controls. How do you currently control your processes? Can we improve them? And assume that every control might have to be changed or improved. And then finally, the last thing that you will get before you have a transition audit with NQA, I can't speak for any other certification bodies, you will be sent a gap analysis form, which will help you transition, but will also be used as part of the assessment. I've got to leave it at that. I've already gone over by 1.5 minutes. I'll be getting my knuckles wrapped. I thank you for your time. I apologise for the slightly shortened speed of this. There will be an email coming out next week with links and copies of the slides. So thank you for your time. Thank you for everything, and reply to the email if you have any additional questions.